Now back to the show. This is The Law Show on CL 650.
I'm leaving on a jet plane. I don't know when I'll be back again.
And welcome back to the show. I'm Zach Spencer, and we're talking about immigration law, citizenship, and immigration lawyers. We have Rudy Kisher here and Alex Stojkovic from MKS Law in downtown Vancouver. And it's the headline of every newspaper. It leads off every newscast. It's all about the new president of the United States, Donald Trump. Rudy, you had mentioned on previous shows that you had inquiries when George W. Bush was elected for the second time, people wanting to maybe come to Canada. Have you had a bump in inquiries to get into Canada?
Yeah, our office definitely has received a lot of inquiries. You know,
did people really follow through, or they just want to rattle?
I think they sort of break down into sort of, two or three different groups, about three different groups. You sort of have people that are sort of have a Canadian connection already, right? So that, maybe their spouse is Canadian, maybe their grandmother was Canadian, and now they've been thinking about moving to Canada. Now they're like, okay, let's actually do this because we don't like the way things are turning, right? Then you've got other people that are sort of, a little bit nervous because they may have they may be part of this illegal population in the United States, right? And so with the talk of getting tougher on that, they're thinking, well, maybe if I can't stay here, can I move to Canada? Is that possible, right? And then it sort of breaks down. Then you have another group, usually very well off, that are very nervous about the policies that are coming in. I mean, it's kind of shocking, very depressing actually to have conversations with people that are worth several $1 million calling, and you say to them, "Well, are you sure about this? Do you really want to move?"
But what's their fear?
Well, I mean, we've had and a good friend of ours has had similar requests from Jewish clients, right, that are calling and they're saying, "Listen, what did they? You called a Jewish person that stayed in Germany in the 30s." An optimist. Thought things were getting better, right? And they may be involved in a mixed marriage, a mixed relationship, and they feel that things aren't going to go well and that they're making plans to move, which is kind of, from our largest trading partner, a country they have a lot of respect for, to hear people with that fear talking about it. When it was George W. Bush, it was about the draft. Like the fear was, I've got a son, I don't know what's going to happen. What happens if we move?
Well, of course, though, as we've said on this show before, we had an equal number of people who were Obama refugees who wanted to leave during Obama because taxes were going to go sky high and they were going to take all our money away from us.
Isn't that ironic that Canada is a haven for people who don't want to pay taxes?
There's a long history of Americans projecting whatever it is they don't like about their own country and pretending that it's better here. Yeah. And they project, they pick and choose some things that they think are better in Canada.
Well, the one thing I have heard is applications to Canadian universities by Americans, which makes sense because you've got a child who's 18, 19 years old going off university. Hey, first of all, we'll send you to Canada. It's cheaper. Yeah. And you're in Canada. And then if you go to school for 4 years, well, maybe if you like it there, you could stay. And how hard is it for students to stay after they've finished?
Well, there's great pathways for them to permanent residence.
And maybe that's what they're thinking, right?
No, that's true. And it isn't actually cheap for Americans. It's just cheaper.
Yes. Well, it depends on how you look at it.
I mean, Americans typically pay 3 times what we pay, if not 4 times what Canadians pay. Same as the Chinese students we have here, or students from India or from Brazil or Mexico.
It's still much cheaper than the U.S.
But it is more often than not much cheaper than the U.S. That's true.
Okay, so NAFTA. Donald Trump has said clearly that he wants to renegotiate or eliminate NAFTA altogether. What is that doing now for clients?
We've both had calls. We had an email I had an email this morning for a software, animation studio. I mean, they have lots of employees here that are here under NAFTA has a category that allows professionals to come back and forth, right? So there's about somewhere between 40 and 60 different professions that are able to come with a simple job offer to come work in Canada.
And so they're broken down quite clearly.
Yeah, very, very clearly. So it's like nurse, doctor, lawyer, biotechnologist, like very, very specific.
C-suite people, right? And those sorts of people?
Yeah, professionals, mostly sort of professionals, with good earning potential coming into Canada. It's been fairly easy for them to come in, and there's lots of them here. And so now the employer's asking, well, what happens if this gets, what am I going to do with my labor force if this gets canceled?
So this is an excellent example. Let's use Rudy's example that he just gave. So in the visual effects field in Vancouver, where we have, in our old neighborhood in Yaletown, you literally have thousands of, probably 2,000 workers in that field alone.
Mm-hmm. And that's just Yaletown.
That's just Yaletown. the section of NAFTA that was used was NOC code F5241, which is graphic designer. Graphic designer was stretched to basically cover animators, to cover computer programmers in that field, okay, which also is a separate heading for computer programmers.
I want to know what the other code is. Do you memorize all of them?
Sure,
Do you know them all?
I know them all. Just all your yeah.
That's impressive.
So the key thing here, though, is that all of these businesses they've built a business model around the idea that they can move people relatively easily.
Because a lot of them have studios in California.
Exactly.
And they come back and
exactly
forth,
right.
Well, if you look at sorry, go ahead.
So now what Trump is talking about is pulling the U.S. out of NAFTA. And what does that mean if they pull out of NAFTA? What does that mean to Canada? What does it mean to this business model? And that's the question that's on people's minds. So I think the two of us have an answer for that question. I'm going to let Rudy take the first part of the answer.
Right, I was just going to say, when you were talking about business plans, I mean, you take a company like Microsoft, part of the plan is we're going to be able to, because Canada's immigration policy is more open to skilled workers coming in, they've set up the office here with the idea we're going to bring in Indian software programmers, come over here, have them get permanent residence, have them get citizenship, and then we'll be able to move them down to the States. So we're going to solve our labor problem not being dependent on U.S. immigration because of NAFTA.
So
right?
they would backdoor it through Canada.
Exactly. So, that's a long-term program that's going to, for something like that to material, is going to take 10 years. This is going to throw that into, is it going to be viable in the future?
So what would your suggestion be?
Well, first off, I'm not sure that we need to be overly concerned yet. If the United States did pull out of NAFTA, my understanding of the law is that they would have to give 6 months' notice. All right? So for 6 months, NAFTA would continue on from that notice point. The second point that I think is important is not to minimize the effects of NAFTA being eliminated. If the treaty was abrogated and we returned to what was there before the treaty, well, in Canada's case, we had a free trade agreement, the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, and I don't understand legally why that treaty wouldn't immediately take effect. Mm-hmm. And that treaty, which was from 1989, if, those of us who are old enough to recall, the 1988 election was essentially fought over that. That was
the GST election too, wasn't it?
No, the GST was.
Oh no, that was the Canada Free Trade Agreement.
It was Canada Free Trade Agreement. It was Mulroney and Turner and that big debate in 1988 at the end of that year.
Around 94 was the GST one, I think. Yeah.
So the net effect of that would be to return us to that old free trade agreement, and for most of the immigration portion, they basically took the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement provisions and placed them inside of NAFTA. So my feeling is that largely those requirements would still be the same. They would obviously change because Mexico would not be part of them the same way, but it would be the Americans would need to take an additional step to get rid of the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. Mm-hmm. So if they decide to do that as well, then we have a serious problem because this moves us back to 1988, a place where we have not been for a long time. But thus far, I haven't heard that that's the plan of this administration.
It doesn't even seem to be on the radar, really.
It doesn't.
In terms of, it's more about trade as opposed to movement of professionals back and forth across the border.
And that would really make sense to them because it goes both ways. Right?
Yeah, and we're small potatoes. I
think the guns are clearly facing south on this one towards Mexico, right?
Yeah, that does seem to be the case.
Yeah. Okay, Citizenship Act, stuck in the Senate. So what is the new act, and what are we hoping to get when this finally passes?
Well, the Citizenship Act was a comprehensive change aimed at three things. First, it was aimed at changing the residence rules, which were seen as being the physical presence rules that when the Conservatives did a comprehensive change in 2014 were seen as too restrictive. 4 years out of 6 of physical presence in Canada was what would be required to be eligible for citizenship. That's been rolled back to 3 years out of 5.
And not consecutive.
Not consecutive, right. No. So that's the first change. Second, there was a peeling back of some of those provisions to allow for credit for work permits and study permit holders, which used to have credit towards their citizenship, a limited amount of credit for the days they had spent legally in Canada. That was eliminated by the Conservatives when their Citizenship Act amendments were passed in 2014. And finally, the one that was the campaign promise by the Liberals and that both parties campaigned hard on was that revocation of citizenship in the case of Canadians who committed terrorist offenses abroad or who were convicted of treason, sedition, and various other offenses in Canada. There was a provision that you could now lose your citizenship because of that, even if you were a Canadian citizen, as long as there was a right to a second citizenship that you held. So it created a class of citizenship for people that were dual, where they could actually lose their citizenship if they were convicted of offenses. This was an election issue. I mean, the Liberals ran on the idea that a citizen is a citizen is a citizen, whereas the Conservatives ran on the idea that, wasn't their line
harder to get and easier
harder
to lose?
to get, easier to lose, right? So this is the third element that was completely eliminated by this. This act eliminated the revocation procedures for all of those terrorist-type offenses, sedition, treason, etc. And it was actually passed by the House on June 26th of last year. So why is this still news?
But what's happened is that the Senate now they don't have a whip in the Senate,
they
right?
They do not,
yeah.
And so they're free to vote with their conscience. And the Senate is now growing in power. They're sending bills back. They did that on the right to die legislation.
They did, yeah.
And so they're starting to flex their muscle like as an upper chamber should have had in all these years.
Well,
so do you think this is going to continue?
I think
because Trudeau said that they don't have to vote on party lines.
I think it's it's sitting it's gone to committee now, right? So it was in first reading, second reading at the Senate. It's been sent to committee. And another problem that's come is the way you lose your citizenship. So under the old, before these recent changes, you used to have a long, lengthy judicial review process, actually an application they used to court. Alex has done plenty of these, in which you would have a chance to sort of argue that you shouldn't lose your citizenship.
It was like a trial,
you
like a proper trial, really, with evidence called and things like that.
Now, if you're losing your citizenship on misrepresentation, it's done basically by the decision of an officer, and you don't, except for judicial review, you've got absolutely no right to get a hearing that. So you get a parking ticket, you can go to a court and be heard by a judge. You shouldn't get that to pay a $30 fine. You lose your citizenship, you get no oral hearing. It is absolutely unbelievable. And so there's a case launched that basically this shouldn't be the case. Because there's about 3,000 of these cases the government is moving ahead with. And I think there's some sort of push. There's been a bit of pushback that perhaps those provisions should be included in this citizenship bill that's before the Senate now. So that might be a problem.
The Senate might go back with changes.
Might come back, yeah.
All right. So we'll leave it there for this segment. When we come back, we're going to get into a whole bunch of other things. Parents and grandparents coming into the country, sponsorship of spouses, and a whole bunch more, talking about immigration and citizenship with Rudy Kisher and Alex Stojkovic from MKS Law in downtown Vancouver. We'll talk more about that next on CL 650.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CL 650.